Ladies and gentlemen, we are told we are born as blank slates, shaped solely by culture, education, and the state. But this is ideology disguised as science. The ruling class, the economic elite. They benefit when human nature is erased, when we are seen only as passive products of the environment. Why? Because if everything is learned, then inequality is always someone's fault, not the system's. But what if we have instincts, drives shaped by evolution? What if cooperation and competition are both in us? Then society must be built to align with not a race, our nature. The myth of the blank slate serves political and economic interests by denying innate human traits. This idea, that humans are born with no inherent tendencies or predispositions, has long appealed to those who benefit from shaping individuals to fit into predefined roles within society. If human nature does not exist, then people can be molded like clay to serve institutional power structures. The state can manufacture obedience, corporations can manufacture consumers, and hierarchies can justify inequality as the product of culture rather than biology. This is not just a philosophical debate. It's a political weapon used to preserve the interests of elites who shape policy, economy, and ideology. Throughout history, systems of control have depended on a compliant population. The blank slate ideology fits perfectly into this need. It tells us that people are not born aggressive, competitive, curious, or cooperative. They are made that way through environmental conditioning. That means any social failure, any inequality, any injustice is a result of poor conditioning or failed education, not the system itself. When working-class children underperform in a rigid education system, the blank slate narrative blames their environment, not the structural inequality that produced it. It tells them they can be anything if they just work harder, learn better, behave properly, never questioning the system that demands they be infinitely malleable and perpetually obedient. This is where the ideological manipulation becomes clearest. If everyone starts life as a blank slate, then the massive disparities in wealth and opportunity must be the outcome of how they were written on. It removes biology, history, and power from the equation. It tells the factory worker he could have been a CEO if only he'd applied himself. It tells the student drowning in debt that her economic hardship is not systemic but personal. And all the while, it protects the ruling class from accountability. They can claim meritocracy while enforcing oligarchy, claiming that unequal outcomes reflect unequal effort or culture, not the unequal starting points imposed by birth, race, class, or inherited privilege. Science, particularly in the wake of Darwin and modern genetics, has increasingly challenged the blank slate. Evolutionary psychology, behavioral genetics, and neuroscience have all shown that while environment matters, it interacts constantly with inherited traits. Infants show personality differences before culture touches them. Identical twins raised apart show remarkable similarities. Our capacity for language, our tendency toward empathy, our sense of fairness, even our aggression, all have roots in biology. Yet to accept this would mean acknowledging limits to how people can be manipulated by systems of power. It would force a reckoning with the false promises of total social engineering. It would expose that many so-called reforms fail not because of the people, but because of the denial of human nature. Denying innate traits also allows institutions to offload blame. A prison system that produces higher recidivism is not flawed. According to the blank slate model, the problem lies in failing to reprogram the prisoner effectively. The educational system doesn't need reform. Students simply need more discipline or better curricula. The workplace isn't exploitative. Workers just haven't been trained properly in how to climb the corporate ladder. In all these scenarios, the system is beyond critique, and the individual is wholly responsible. This serves the ruling class perfectly, as they can point to failure after failure and say, it's not us, it's them. But let's flip the script. What happens if we acknowledge that humans have evolved tendencies toward both cooperation and conflict, toward fairness and self-interest? Then social structures must be designed not to overwrite those tendencies, but to align with them. It means inequality is not just a moral failure, but a biological mismatch, a misalignment between our evolved nature and our imposed institutions. For instance, humans evolved in small cooperative groups where reciprocity and fairness were key to survival. Modern capitalism, with its emphasis on hyper-competition, alienation, and individual accumulation, runs counter to that biology. It creates a system where natural instincts are suppressed or distorted, leading to stress, inequality, and social decay. And yet the blank slate myth persists, especially in academic and political circles aligned with neoliberal ideology. Why? Because it allows those in power to pretend that everything is fixable through policy tweaks and behavior management, not structural transformation. If there is no human nature, there is no need to question capitalism itself. Only to better train the worker, better test the student, better punish the criminal. It's an endless cycle of blame and reform that never touches the real issue, a system fundamentally at odds with what it means to be human. This myth also serves authoritarian regimes. If humans are blank slates, then the state has total legitimacy to shape citizens into whatever form it deems necessary. Dissent becomes pathology, not politics. Resistance is a failure of conditioning, not a reflection of natural outrage. Totalitarian ideologies, from Maoist re-education camps to capitalist HR departments, thrive on the belief that people can be rewritten at will. The myth of the blank slate becomes the philosophical foundation for surveillance, censorship, propaganda, and social control. And the masses, stripped of any rooted identity or nature, become endlessly pliable subjects of manipulation. Even in progressive spaces, this myth can be seductive. It suggests that with the right education, the right social program, the right ideology, people can be liberated from all past conditioning. But this leads to disappointment, frustration, and often authoritarian imposition in the name of liberation. If people don't conform to the utopia imagined by the blank slate model, then the model doesn't get questioned. The people do. History is littered with revolutions that tried to engineer new humans from scratch and ended up producing repression instead of freedom. Because to ignore human nature is to ignore the very thing that makes freedom possible, our innate desire for autonomy, meaning, and fairness. Moreover, the myth erases the possibility of solidarity grounded in shared traits. If we are all just products of environment, then we have no common foundation. But if we acknowledge that all humans share deep psychological and emotional wiring, then we have a basis for empathy, cooperation, and collective action. Solidarity does not require sameness, but it does require understanding the nature we share. Without that, politics becomes identity without unity, resistance without cohesion, struggle without vision. By clinging to the blank slate, society clings to a lie that benefits the powerful and punishes the vulnerable. It is not science, but ideology, not liberation, but manipulation. And until we recognize it as such, we will keep fighting the symptoms while protecting the disease. We will keep telling the oppressed to change themselves instead of changing the structures that oppress them. We will keep investing in programs to reshape individuals while leaving untouched the systems that deform lives by design. The blank slate myth keeps us trapped in a loop of false hope and real despair. A loop engineered by those who need us to believe that all failure is personal and all success is cultural. Recognizing human nature challenges both extreme social engineering and rigid market ideologies. For too long, political and economic systems have operated on assumptions about human beings that ignore the scientific understanding of our evolved psychology. When regimes of the left imagine that people can be entirely reprogrammed into selfless agents of the collective, they fall into the trap of engineering new human models without limits. When regimes of the right assume that people are rational, self-interested calculators driven purely by market incentives, they flatten our complexity into numbers on a spreadsheet. Both visions, one utopian, the other transactional, deny the messy, contradictory, and deeply ingrained nature of what it means to be human. And both fail because they build their structures on sand, not on the foundation of human psychology and behavior that has been shaped over millennia. Evolution did not produce beings that are easily molded into bureaucratic agents of the state or hyper-efficient market actors. It produced individuals who form tribes, seek fairness, experience empathy, respond to threats with aggression or fear, and crave meaning beyond material gain. These characteristics can't be erased by ideology or replaced by incentives. Attempts to do so often end in disaster. The 20th century saw several grand experiments in social engineering, from Soviet collectivization to Mao's Cultural Revolution to capitalist consumer indoctrination, each attempting to remake people to fit an ideological vision. Each ran into the same obstacle human nature pushed back. People resisted, not because they were irrational or uneducated, but because the systems asked them to become something they were not. When you ignore human nature, you make promises that cannot be kept. The market, for example, assumes that if everyone acts out of self-interest, the invisible hand will guide society to optimal outcomes. But humans don't act purely out of self-interest. We are social creatures driven by status, recognition, trust, loyalty, and emotional intuition. Markets cannot account for these values, so they either try to commodify them, turning relationships into transactions, or ignore them, leading to alienation. The result is a society flooded with choice, but starved of meaning. Consumption becomes a substitute for connection. But no number of purchases can replace the need to belong, to matter, or to live with purpose. When people feel this void, the market tells them to buy more. It cannot offer meaning, only products. It cannot build community, only customer bases. The deeper needs remain unmet, and the system blames individuals for their discontent. On the other hand, centrally planned systems that imagine they can eliminate selfishness or erase hierarchy through education and propaganda often find themselves enforcing conformity through fear. They underestimate the extent to which competition, hierarchy, and resource control are built into our evolutionary history. That doesn't mean these tendencies must be glorified or left unchecked, but it means they cannot be abolished by decree. Systems must work with human tendencies, not pretend they don't exist. Acknowledging human nature doesn't mean accepting injustice or giving up on progress. It means designing institutions that channel our drives toward cooperation, fairness, and mutual benefit, rather than trying to stamp out what can't be erased. Recognizing human nature does not mean embracing determinism. It does not mean that biology is destiny or that change is impossible. What it does mean is understanding the constraints and possibilities that come with being human. For instance, humans are capable of profound empathy, but mostly within groups they perceive as their own. We're quick to judge outsiders, defend our in-group, and justify cruelty when framed as justice. This isn't a moral flaw, it's a survival strategy developed over tens of thousands of years. Knowing this, we can create narratives, policies, and educational systems that expand the circle of empathy rather than naively assuming everyone will spontaneously embrace universal values. The denial of human nature allows ideology to reign unchecked. It allows theorists to imagine utopias without friction, economists to construct models without people, and politicians to promise change without acknowledging the limitations of human behavior. This creates a cycle of disillusionment when policies fail. The blame falls not on the flawed assumptions, but on the people themselves. They are told they didn't try hard enough, weren't educated properly, or resisted progress. But the truth is simpler. The system didn't account for who people are. It tried to shape a society for idealized humans instead of real ones. And when real humans pushed back, through apathy, resistance, or defection, they were punished or pathologized. In the realm of economics, the consequences are particularly stark. Free market capitalism assumes that individuals are rational agents who seek to maximize utility. But behavioral economics has shown this to be a myth. People are loss-averse, inconsistent, emotional, and heavily influenced by social context. They don't always make choices that are good for them, and they often don't act in ways that benefit long-term social stability. Yet policies are still crafted under the assumption that the invisible hand will correct for these flaws. It doesn't. Instead, it leads to bubbles, crashes, and growing inequality. Recognizing human nature would mean acknowledging that markets need regulation, not just to prevent abuse, but to account for the limits of human decision-making. It would mean protecting people from their own biases, not punishing them for having them. In education, too, the blank slate model encourages endless reform without reflection. If all behavior is learned, then any failing student is just a curriculum tweak away from success. But this ignores the reality of cognitive differences, emotional trauma, genetic predispositions, and developmental pathways that influence learning. Acknowledging human nature would push us to focus on diverse educational strategies, realistic expectations, and structural support rather than blaming individuals for not meeting standardized benchmarks. It would help educators understand their students not as empty vessels to be filled, but as complex beings with potential shaped by both nature and nurture. This recognition is also crucial for justice. The criminal justice system, in both authoritarian and liberal states, is often based on flawed assumptions about behavior and reform. It imagines that punishment will deter, that incarceration will rehabilitate, and that crime is simply a moral failure. But humans don't respond predictably to punishment. Many offenders have neurological or psychological conditions shaped by early trauma, social deprivation, or genetic factors. Acknowledging this doesn't excuse harm, but it does shift the focus from punishment to prevention, from retribution to repair. It moves us away from moralizing and toward understanding, which is the foundation of any humane system of justice. In public discourse, acknowledging human nature could elevate political conversation. Too often, debates are framed as if society is an engineering problem to be solved with the right algorithm or policy. But society is a living organism made of humans, not machines. Recognizing our nature would mean crafting political visions rooted in realism, not abstraction. It would mean embracing the tension between freedom and order, between individual desire and collective need. It would mean asking not only what kind of society we want, but what kind of species we are, and how we can build systems that honor that reality without being constrained by it. Recognizing human nature creates a middle path between utopian dreaming and cynical fatalism. It rejects the idea that people can be anything if shaped correctly, and it also rejects the claim that we are selfish automatons doomed to conflict. Instead, it insists that we are complex, contradictory beings, capable of violence and love, greed and generosity, selfishness and sacrifice. Systems that acknowledge this can create spaces where cooperation thrives, where fairness is incentivized, where inequality is checked not through wishful thinking but through structural design. When we see human beings as they are, not as we wish them to be, we gain the clarity to build systems that reflect our real needs and aspirations. A realistic view of human nature is essential for building just and sustainable social systems. When social theories and institutions are grounded in fantasy rather than in an empirical understanding of who we are, the result is often oppression disguised as reform, chaos framed as freedom, or stagnation posing as stability. The refusal to account for what science and experience tell us about human behavior has produced systems that either overreach in their control or fail to protect the vulnerable. A realistic view doesn't mean resigning to injustice or inequality. It means accepting the range of tendencies humans have evolved and designing systems that anticipate and guide those tendencies towards socially beneficial outcomes. Humans are not infinitely malleable, nor are they permanently fixed. We are born with certain predispositions toward language, attachment, cooperation, status-seeking, and in-group loyalty. These traits are shaped by context, but they are not erased by it. Any system that ignores this will find itself perpetually confused by human behavior. A school that expects children to sit quietly for hours without addressing their need for movement, social interaction, and emotional expression will punish normal behavior as deviance. A workplace that assumes adults are motivated only by salary will fail to inspire creativity, loyalty, or initiative. A government that expects citizens to follow laws without trust, participation, or shared values will struggle to maintain legitimacy. Social design must begin with a truthful assessment of what people are like, not with an idealized version of what they should become. This is especially true in times of crisis. When systems break down, economically, politically, or environmentally, human nature becomes more visible. People form groups for protection. They prioritize kin and community. They cooperate intensely within those groups, while sometimes becoming suspicious of outsiders. These reactions are not failures of morality. They are adaptive responses shaped by evolution. Systems that anticipate such behaviors can manage crisis with more resilience. Those that deny or suppress these reactions often find themselves overwhelmed by chaos and disobedience. Designing for human nature means building systems that can bend without breaking, adapt without collapsing, and guide without coercing. One of the most critical areas where this realism must apply is in addressing inequality. Too often, inequality is justified by assuming that people get what they deserve in a meritocratic system. This overlooks both structural barriers in human nature. People are not born with equal capacities, equal social support, or equal access to opportunity. They vary in temperament, ability, and resilience. This variation is natural, and a just society must accommodate it. Equality of opportunity does not mean pretending everyone starts at the same place. It means actively correcting for the differences that limit people's ability to flourish. A realistic view of human nature demands that we move beyond slogans and design policies that acknowledge how people actually grow, learn, and struggle. Sustainability, too, hinges on understanding human nature. Environmental degradation is not simply a technical issue, it's a human one. People tend to prioritize short-term needs over long-term benefits, especially when resources are scarce or when future threats feel abstract. This is not irrational. It's part of our evolutionary legacy. Ancestors who focused on immediate survival were more likely to pass on their genes. But in a world of climate change and ecological limits, this short-termism becomes dangerous. A sustainable system must therefore design incentives, institutions, and narratives that align immediate behavior with long-term goals. This could mean policies that reward conservation, frameworks that encourage communal responsibility, or education that cultivates future-oriented thinking. But all of it must begin with an honest acknowledgement of why people act the way they do, and how systems can work with those instincts rather than against them. Social trust is another area where realism about human nature is essential. Humans are cooperative by nature, but that cooperation is conditional. It depends on reciprocity, fairness, and mutual recognition. When people perceive systems as unjust or corrupt, trust erodes. When they see elites breaking rules while demanding obedience from the rest, the social contract weakens. A system that expects people to cooperate must earn that cooperation by being transparent, accountable, and fair. Trust cannot be manufactured through slogans or enforced through surveillance. It must be cultivated through consistent and visible alignment between values and actions. Understanding this basic human need for fairness and reciprocity is central to designing systems that can endure over time. Moreover, a realistic view of human nature encourages humility in policymaking. Grand utopias often fail because they assume too much. They assume people will act against their interests, suppress their desires, or abandon centuries of cultural conditioning overnight. They assume central plans can replace spontaneous social order. They assume that people will trust abstract promises over lived experience. These assumptions lead to overreach, disillusionment, and backlash. A system grounded in a realistic view of human nature begins instead with modesty. It asks what is possible given who we are. It seeks change that is incremental, participatory, and reversible. It learns from feedback and adapts. It builds institutions that are strong enough to endure but flexible enough to evolve. This view also calls into question the moral binaries often used to justify systems. The idea that people are inherently good and corrupted by society, or inherently evil and restrained by force, simplifies a far more complex reality. People are capable of both altruism and cruelty, often in the same context. A just system does not rely on virtue or fear alone. It creates conditions that make good behavior easier and bad behavior harder. It builds environments where cooperation is rewarded, where power is checked, and where those who falter are met with support rather than exclusion. This is not cynicism. It is the deepest form of care, a system that protects people not by idealizing them, but by understanding them. The institutions we rely on, schools, markets, governments, families, are all products of social design. And social design is most successful when it starts with accurate models of human behavior. The more we learn about the brain, the genome, and the social environment, the more we see that behavior is neither fixed nor infinitely flexible. It is a dance between biology and context. Systems that recognize this dance can become more adaptive, equitable, and humane. Systems that ignore it will continue to generate conflict, inequality, and failure. Power structures often resist this realism. Why? Because acknowledging human nature limits their ability to shift blame onto individuals or promise impossible outcomes. A political movement that admits people are tribal, emotional, and status-driven cannot easily sell a vision of universal harmony. A market ideology that recognizes people are not rational consumers cannot easily justify deregulation or privatization. And yet, these uncomfortable truths are necessary for progress. Denial may be convenient for power, but it is disastrous for society. Only when we confront who we are can we begin to imagine systems that help us become better, not perfect, not programmable, but better. Human nature is not an obstacle to justice. It is the terrain on which justice must be built. The sooner we accept this, the sooner we can stop designing systems that fail the people they are meant to serve. A truly just and sustainable society does not begin with abstract ideals. It begins with a deep understanding of the human condition, in all its complexity, contradiction, and potential. It begins with the courage to see ourselves clearly, and the wisdom to build accordingly,